Welcome to Arcane. There's been no shortage of content praising Arcane, the League of Legends epic distributed by Netflix in the fall of 2021, and there is much that deserves praise. The presentation is incredible, the visuals are beautiful, the music is awesome. From a narrative standpoint, the series is lauded for its exercise in developing multiple characters and plot threads across 9 episodes. It has good characters. It employs subtlety and visual storytelling. I don't mean to use these buzzwords in a demeaning manner, only that they encapsulate what many people do recognize in this show. The way a character's eyes move, the small grunts, not anime ones, but noises and gestures more at home in the Western language.
I'm giving the big address tonight.
We really have to send it to Anarchy.
All of us old-timey American fans had to develop an immunity to the medium's barriers through old-fashioned desensitization.
Is somebody in here?
No such therapy is necessary today. There's more anime these days, more quality too, and it's becoming rapidly more integrated with other media. Today's children are spoiled, hot take. Arcane is just a recent example of this. A marriage between a brand of anime-derived visuals set in a language that I grew up with. It's perfect, and people are right to point out these positives. But the reason I wanted to write this essay was to talk about the show's reflection of reality, poverty, and inequality. Some introduction to the setting is necessary. The story is set in the world of League of Legends, a massive online RTS, and weaves around multiple characters in the city of Piltover, where the split between rich and poor is vivid and provides the main fault for civil unrest. There's also magic, arcane or whatever.
Hey, that's the name of the
And some of the characters are from the game. There's a lot of plot in Arcane, and for the sake of brevity, I won't articulate every major story beat or even interaction in this essay. For probably worse, I'm going to discuss Arcane under the assumption that whoever watches this video has already seen it, or doesn't mind following the points made here from my incomplete descriptions. My goal is to touch on the story of Arcane only for the context to the points I wish to make about inequality and poverty in the real world. Hopefully, if you have not seen the series, this video may encourage you to check it out. When I did, I was impressed with the presentation from the start, but the part that made me pause and think that this might actually be a classic is a transition that happened between the end of episode 3 and the beginning of episode 4. At the end of episode 3, the characters Jace and Victor succeed in creating a new technology. Episode 4 opens 5 years later, when Piltover has prospered. Clearly, technological progress has moved by bounds, and a new day has even been created in appreciation of this technological revolution, called a Progress Day. But things are worse. The violence depicted in episode 3 resulted in the deaths of the two most pragmatic and stabilizing individuals, Vander, who kept the Undercity from revolting, and Grayson, who kept the topside from clumsily provoking them. For better and worse, these two are presented as instrumental in maintaining the status quo. Grayson, because she doesn't have the power to do otherwise, we'll get to this, and Vander, because he isn't willing to do what it takes to force otherwise. As a result, the Undercity has fallen into a deeper rut. Their relationship with the topside has deteriorated. Each side has more successfully othered the other. Lines of separation have become more entrenched, and Silco, the new de facto head of the Undercity, is laser-focused on a project to violently upset the established order to the detriment of the people around him. In the meantime, Jace's Hextech works. Piltover has become a technological wonder, a world leader. They did it. Wealth was created, and yet, for many people, things are not better. Why?
Next, the second of a two-part look at a bestseller that's provoking discussion and debate about inequality and growth in America.
Capital in the 21st Century came out in 2014, and it turned heads in the wider consciousness, mostly because it took esoteric information like published tax data and drew a convincing through line to a very bleak situation that most people can understand. Thomas Picketty started his economic career as a professor at MIT, but in his words, he took issue with what he called the comfortably prevailing narrative that as long as more capital is generated and less capital is taxed, the dynamics of this unregulated system will result in better quality of life for everyone. Sure, there might be inequality, but that isn't the problem in and of itself. These policies of low private capital extraction and more efficiency and more growth will ultimately raise the greater wealth for everyone, and may even prevent the inequality gap from becoming meaningfully harmful. The work of Picketty and other economists started over 10 years prior to Capital's publication is basically a rebuttal of that narrative. By gathering published data from France, Japan, Britain, and the United States going back 2 centuries, Picketty and other researchers assert that inequality across the developed world is already at a level harmful to society. It isn't going to get better, and it will only get worse with passivity, and possibly some type of societal collapse. These assertions are explored further in a later book, Capital and Ideology, published in 2019. The way I will articulate the crux of his thesis is to picture inequality as a naturally occurring force in an unregulated ecosystem of capitalism. Picketty never says this outright, but it's an analogy that makes the most sense to me. Now, it's important to point out that inequality is a byproduct of wealth being generated in the first place. I take for granted that capital accumulation and the resulting inequality are not bad things in principle. What reading Picketty's work did for me, and I know everyone will have their own experiences, was give me an insight that maybe inequality isn't limited in an unregulated economy. Perhaps, like entropy, the tendency for energy to be lost in an open system, inequality will naturally expand, and that tendency will ultimately prove disastrous for everyone involved. That's my hot take anyway. Here's what Picketty has to say. When the rate of return on capital significantly exceeds the growth rate of the economy, as it did through much of history until the 19th century and is likely to be the case again in the 21st century, then it logically follows that inherited wealth grows faster than output and income. People with inherited wealth need only save a portion of their income from capital to see that growth grow more quickly than the economy as a whole. Under such conditions, it is almost inevitable that inherited wealth will dominate wealth amassed from a lifetime of labor by a wide margin, and the concentration of capital will attain extremely high levels potentially incompatible with the meritocratic values and principles of social justice fundamental to modern democratic societies. Picketty refers to people, but this tendency of disproportionate capital accumulation applies to entities that can acquire wealth, generally large corporations, banks, and endowments, where access to their capital is available only to a select group of individuals. Much of the 2 books focus on trying to support this assertion. The now famous R greater than G equation, where R represents the average annual rate of return on capital, including profits, dividends, interests, rents, and other income, expressed as a percentage of its total value, and G stands for the growth rate of the economy. This may sound like a lot, but for the lay such as I, it's probably the most digestible takeaway from both books. Picketty's assertion is that, in the long run, simply owning a piece of the pie will, over time, disproportionately reward you relative to others who own relatively little.
Let me introduce Jane and Joe. They both earn $100,000 a year. But Jane also has a $10 million inheritance which she invests annually in the stock market. Jane's $10 million has now grown to be worth more than $16 million, demonstrating Picketty's argument that the difference in interest between R and G can lead to widening inequality over time.
And this is assuming the proportion of capital remains the same. In practice, having capital allows you to buy out more capital from others who have less. This can take the form of buying large amounts of publicly traded stock, property, debt, small business, whole companies, and ultimately other people's livelihoods. In the worst cases, a monopoly of ownership can form, where the monopolizing entity can further limit capital accumulation of other individuals by depressing wages or other benefit forms to the minimum supported by the market, which is determined by supply and demand and independent of any considerations of fairness or common good. Over the past few years, we find that the top decile's share of the income distribution has risen almost everywhere. And when we look more closely at the data, we find that the increase in inequality has come at the expense of the bottom 50% of the distribution, whose share of total income stood at about 20 to 25% in 1980 in all 5 regions, but had fallen to 15 to 20% in 2018, and indeed as low as 10% in the United States. As an aside, I would argue that we can see this dynamic play out in the US housing market, where ownership very much appears to favor established wealth. We see a widening gap and worsening trajectory of historically oppressed populations along the line of skin color. Because wealth builds over generations, stunting effects such as racial exclusion in the New Deal policies and the infamous redlining shape the economic landscape in the US today. Another sign of harmful inequality that Picketty likes to give is the explosion of executive salaries, which, he argues, has more to do with where bargaining power is concentrated than any evaluation of productivity.
I was an outsider the moment I stepped foot in Piltover. We didn't have the benefits of a patron or a name.
One thing I like about Arcane is that it actually displays class disparities among the rich, particularly the precariousness on which they stand within this social class. Jace is an exceptionally gifted individual from a poorer house of clockmakers, but because of disparity, this basically makes him wealthy in comparison to most everyone else. It also puts him at a disadvantage in the upper topside circle. His living and research is sponsored by the Academy, and his living arrangement is supported by a wealthy family from a more privileged house. This place grants him access to research and technology that he uses to explore a passion: harnessing magic, or the arcane. He wants to explore and harness this new energy source and turn it into something useful, partly for the greater good, mostly, I suspect, for the challenge, and also because he knows it can be done, because when he was a child, a magician saved him and his mom's life. This allows him to endeavor in his effort against the current dogma that magic can't be utilized in a useful way, and more importantly, it's dangerous. So he engages in forbidden research and works in secret with materials he's not supposed to. Narratively, his story intersects with the characters V and Powder, 2 undercity rats, when they sneak into his lab to steal stuff and inadvertently blow it up. The fallout of this event is juxtaposed to V's previous assumptions about Jace being another rich topsider in an effort to carelessly rationalize her actions. Jace, of course, suffers for this exposure when a brief investigation uncovers he's working with the Arcane. He's kicked out of the Academy and his sponsor's house, cut off from the possibility of continuing his research. He briefly considers suicide before Victor, a more senior Academy member, intercedes, and more importantly, offers his partnership to continue the work.
No, I was intrigued by what you said at the trial.
That makes you the only one.
Yes, well, I wanted to talk about your work, this hex tech.
He sees the promise of utilizing the arcane, and more importantly, he's willing to risk doing it. Their story arc in the first 3 episodes is about taming the arcane and developing Hextech while trying, with a little help, to avoid getting caught before they succeed in developing a stable model. Once they demonstrate it is possible to use the arcane without blowing up half the city, the Academy is more forgiving, and a new age of technology dawns. I bring up this plot thread because I think it feeds back into one of the bigger themes in Arcane, that action is driven by the dissatisfied. Profound, I know. All the characters engaged in trying to upset the status quo are doing so because they are really uncomfortable. The characters already seated comfortably aren't really willing to risk the good things they have to theoretically make the world a better place. The most they can do is accept something once it's established to work. And I think this says something about the current social hierarchy in our own world. The status quo already works for me. Why risk financial, social destruction to improve something? And you can see from this status space, it's easier to cultivate a self-serving mindset. If we try to fix this, we'll make it worse, and things will get better with time. But here's the thing. Maybe not doing anything leads to destruction. Extreme inequality was not the necessary price of prosperity and industrial development. Indeed, all signs are that the excessive concentration of wealth exacerbated social and nationalist tensions while blocking the social and educational investments that made the balanced post-war development model possible. The historical fallout of unmitigated economic inequality can be seen, arguably, in the social unrest of France prior to the Revolution, and more globally, across the early 20th century Europe prior to the start of the First World War. Certainly, there were many factors involved in the start of the First World War. Toxic cultural influences that leaned on the importance of conquest, among others. Certainly, the nation's leaders underestimated the cost of war, but a lot of this social instability, i.e., a limited democratic process and disproportionate amount of power in the wealthy and ruling class, can trace its origin to the excruciating level of economic inequality present across the industrialized world of the time. It is fitting in many ways that the steampunk setting of Arcane is reminiscent of early 20th century industrialized Europe. Noting this, it's worth acknowledging that Arcane was created by Riot, which is owned by Tencent, which is the largest monopolistic conglomerate whose breadth and depth in China is, gross. So it does strike of tremendous hypocrisy that Tencent-owned Riot makes a critique of Western-style class disparity, especially considering the glorious CCP's own anti-democratic totalitarian problems. All I'll say is that it's easy to point out splinters in others' eyes. And just because the loghead says we've got one doesn't mean we don't. A major illustrator of this relationship between instability and inequality is crime. After all, poverty and criminal activity go hand in hand, or intersect. We already know they correlate pretty well, and it's not difficult to see why. Crime pays. This is an important reality to acknowledge when there is plenty of non-illegitimate employment that doesn't. The closer you are on the societal periphery, the more incentives you would have to engage in crime, even in crime that hurts others, which is not something most people want to do. But from a moral standpoint, it is easy to rationalize. After all, society doesn't care about you. Why should you care what those with privileges you don't share think about your behavior? The primary incentives and deterrents to crime then remain practical. Engaging in capital transactions outside the law carries significant risks, loss of freedom, and perhaps more acutely, risks to health and well-being that come from operating in this unregulated ecosystem. We might consider the ecosystem of the criminal underworld unregulated because the arbiters of rules in these systems, crime lords and the like, don't operate with the benefit of legal infrastructure. There are many ugly examples of this. There isn't the same infrastructure for arbitration, rule development, and implementation for antisocial conduct. There's no bureaucracy to enforce rules and limit punishment. Interactions between arbiters are more adversarial because of the nature of the ecosystem they exist in. We don't expect a crime lord to tender the mercy, justice, or restraint we expect in the open legal sphere, because on some level, we recognize the ecosystem they inhabit is pressured from above by legitimate society and squeezed between other actors with whom they share space. We see this practicality and struggle play out in a lot of media. We see this in Arcane. In the first episode, when two criminals are trying to take advantage of someone weaker, Vander sorts them out. He doesn't appeal to the justice or legal infrastructure of Piltover. He tells them not to piss off the bartender, and basically threatens to kill them if they don't honor their contract. He enforces his ethics only by his own strength, presumably because he has to. He has no other choice. The enforcers aren't around, and more importantly, they wouldn't be of much help. The legal infrastructure of Piltover doesn't extend to the Undercity. We'll get to this. Vander must assert his power of arbitration through force and threat of force, perhaps similar to the topside enforcers, but with one important distinction. His ethics lie and die with him. The power structure of the underworld is unstable. In the first 3 episodes, it rests almost exclusively on Vander, and so it can and does become radically altered with his replacement. The main point I want to make is this. Unlike Silco, I believe that the underworld cannot actually fix itself. By episode 9, we understand that Silco's key plan is to separate the Undercity politically from Piltover, to create the nation of Zon. It's implied that he believes doing this will improve the long-term livelihood of his people. At least that's what he says. I remember watching this part and got the impression that this was supposed to be the solution to what Silco recognized as the Undercity's disenfranchisement. It's implied that Vander shared that mission as well, but he lost the will to fight a war, to kill all the people necessary to even have a chance at succeeding. It's not clear if the series writers endorsed this objective of independence as a workable solution to the Undercity being left behind, but I remember watching this scene and actively doubting that independence would even be beneficial in the context of the situation presented. Silco makes plenty of distinction between his people and those in the Overcity. In many ways, he's trying to form battle lines. He's trying to worsen the fracture. But the image he tries to project, and seems to believe, is that the fracture between the Topside and Zon involve factors besides economics as the main drivers at play. Such factors could be ethnic, cultural, or some sort of shared identity. Silco seems to be drawing the distinction in regard to shared heritage. Maybe there's something in the lore I'm not appreciating, but in the context of the narrative presented in the show, the people of Zon can be understood to be a very poor working class who suffered through Piltover's industrial revolution, and have since been left behind by the rest of society, even though their exploitation was instrumental in building it. But that's it. There aren't really other obvious fractures presented in the story. There are cultural distinctions between people who inhabit the top versus the bottom, but they appear to be the product of what might be expected in a place with this kind of wealth stratification. There don't appear to be significant ethnic fractures between the two parts of the city, which is different from real societies where wealth stratification in many places has fractured along racial lines. But in this narrative about Piltover, race is, I suspect, very deliberately painted over, in order to illustrate that it is specifically not the fault line that separates these two places. It's just wealth. Silco presents the people of Zon as a directly oppressed people. His words draw parallels to real-world colonialism. It is true, there is a character of neglect present in colonialism. This is despite many of the powers that engaged in it trying to project an image of benevolent paternalism. But in these grossly unequal power structures, social responsibilities by the governing power were extremely limited to basically non-existent. Usually, they encompass the bare minimum needed to maintain resource extraction, like some food and some shelter, and in the worst cases of colonialism, they didn't even support that. But in addition to neglect, there is a character of direct oppression. Peoples of former colonies weren't citizens of the dominating power. Participation in the economy wasn't limited purely by wealth. There were other barriers, usually skin color, see the racial fault. Silco is trying to use an apple's solution to an orange's problem. Zon isn't a subordinate colonial state. Piltover is more reminiscent of early industrial Europe, where the vast wealth inequality created, in many ways, separate states. But it is implied that the people of the Undercity are citizens. Their oppression is one of negligence, not outward engagement. The people of the Undercity don't suffer the exploitation experienced by, for example, the slave population in Haiti, who between 1791 and 1804 revolted and successfully formed a politically independent state from the French Empire. And if Zon did form an independent state, there would be little to stop the topside from sanctioning the new political entity into the ground, as France subsequently did to Haiti through crippling debt. Couple this with the fact that poor emerging nation states are extremely prone to corruption, and you've got a recipe for another dictator's backwater of Zon, which works out great for Silco, not so much for everyone else. I just don't think the show displays the appropriate cynicism toward this idea. And maybe that's just my opinion, but I think this separation and treaty that Silco is so close to securing by the finale is depicted as the successful culmination of the revolution, which it's not. It's a terrible idea, so thanks to Powder for putting a pin in that. The problems faced by Piltover appear to be more similar to Western societies of this and the previous century, where social infrastructure fails to keep up with societal growth, such as service specialization and efficiency, including automation. In Piltover, there just isn't any social infrastructure beyond the police. These enforcers make up the most prominent social investment from the city. The council uses them to enforce trade restrictions, protect property, and investigate crime. But they aren't ubiquitous enough to actually carry out these services in the Undercity. It's interesting because most Western depictions of these kinds of class dystopias lean heavily on the overbearing presence of law or order enforcements. But in Arcane, the enforcers aren't ever present in the Undercity to protect members of that community. They only engage with the Undercity when the lives and property of the topside are taken or placed in jeopardy. The enforcers aren't wrong to do this. Practically, they exist to protect the topside because, practically, they don't have the resources to do otherwise. They are funded by the topside for the topside. If there was a social contract that dictated a larger responsibility to protect all the citizens in Piltover, it is practically inert. As a result, the enforcers' engagements end up taking the form of an occupying army, clumsy and largely effective only in maintaining transient peace through the threat of overbearing violence. So the solution seems evident. Increase the size of the enforcers, make them ubiquitous in the Undercity, arrest all the criminals and enlarge the prison system, create a police state. Would that be much better than the current situation? Well, maybe in some ways. For one thing, Silco presumably wouldn't be able to operate with impunity. It would probably cut down on petty crime, but making criminal activity harder is only one piece of the puzzle. Society has to allow people to fulfill their needs, and if your society allows people to be exploited out of their pursuit of happiness, like a secure future for themselves and even their children, the social order loses its legitimacy. In Piltover, it's questionable whether even basic needs are being met. Relying exclusively on force to maintain order is widely known to be a dumb thing, and an ultimately unsustainable positive feedback loop where more and more resources end up being spent to neutralize human ones. Ultimately, one might consider this capital better spent elsewhere. In short, the enforcers aren't equipped to fix the problem because they are a hammer, confronted with a societal problem that demands other tools. But what would these other tools look like? To get a better idea, it might be useful to briefly go over some culpable reinforcers of poverty. There are different ways these factors can be presented, but maybe we can appreciate them in some chronological order. Let's start before someone is born.
Okay, just to get a sense of who's here, how many of you think there is a genetic influence on sexual orientation? Okay. How many think it is possible for prenatal events to influence your political opinions 30 years later?
Robert Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinology researcher and professor at Stanford University. You may have seen him from his lecture on human behavioral biology, available on YouTube. These videos have a lot of views and he has a lot of interesting things to say. One of his most recent publications, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, recounts many of the breakthroughs of the past 50 years in understanding human behavior and tries to digest them for a more popular consumption. There's a lot of good stuff in here, but for the purpose of this essay, I want to draw attention to some of his assertions regarding the effect of environment. I think most of us can understand that the environment has an enormous effect on human development, but Sapolsky gives us some tangible examples which help ground this perspective. It might sound like I'm scrounging for excuses as to why Timmy is such a son of a bitch, but really, deconstructing the notion of intrinsic meritocratic value requires us to accept that people cannot be evaluated by merit in a vacuum. So chronic stress isn't good. It's not good on anyone, especially children, and it has appreciable but not concretely defined effect at the prenatal stage. To dumb down and abridge, excess glucocorticoids, which for this context can be thought of as stress hormones, affect brain development by inhibiting growth factors resulting in decreased number of neurons and synapses in certain places. Or said in another way, chronic stress blunts the brain development in ways we might not like. In addition, maternal nutrition and health is a well-known factor. Everyone knows it's challenging to have a child on a low-calorie diet, but nutrition deficits from chronically abysmal diets are common in developed countries too, and they're disproportionately represented among the poor. Within developed countries, financially poor mothers are more predisposed to diabetes or pre-diabetes, obesity, higher risk of depression, higher risk for postpartum health compromise. Turns out, gestating another living being takes a toll on the human body. So poor nutrition and low socioeconomics are linked in a vicious cycle which in and of itself is worth exploring. But they affect human development prior to the fetal conception and well into the gestation period. So right off the bat, cognitive function may be compromised from what it could have been, and we haven't even been born yet. This poor nutrition environment and chronic stress continues into childhood. Chronic stress, it turns out, is bad for growing up. Obviously, there might be disagreement as to what kind of stress is good versus bad, but I think many people can agree that being in the presence of domestic violence, gang warfare, and gun violence is bad. All of these things are associated with growing up poor. And studies do show that for weeks after witnessing this kind of violence, there is an impaired concentration and impulse control. Being threatened with danger all the time is a bad thing, especially for children. This goes back to stress hormone response. I'm not going to pretend that this area of research is completely understood, not even close, but we do know that chronically high glucocorticoid release atrophies and blunts the hippocampus and the frontal cortex, the parts that, for the sake of simplicity, help us make wiser decisions. These stress hormones also lead to higher reactivity in the amygdala, which combined with a dampened frontal cortex results in increased anxiety and poorer impulse control. The risk factors from this are obvious: drugs, addiction, violence. This is not to argue for an excuse of criminal activity, which can and has been done. For the purpose of this essay, I'll assume that people need to be held accountable for their actions. Whether that's fair or not is a deeper philosophical question, and the gray areas are, well, where the law gets in. The bigger point in running down some of these environmental examples is that addressing poverty and crime, for that matter, will take a holistic approach. Being satisfied with locking up violent offenders isn't enough. We need to support efforts to address the roots of the problem, which is poverty, its lack of investment precisely where it is needed most. Background culture is also worth noting. Sapolsky highlights a 2008 science paper examining the relationship between math scores and sex equality across 40 countries. The study found that more gender equality led to less discrepancy, with the difference in Scandinavian countries being statistically insignificant. This study was more of a response to the questionable assertion that males are better at math than females due to an underlying biological component. But this highlights part of the problem. Inequality breeds rationalization as to why the left behind got left behind. The show doesn't really lean into this issue of environmental compromise so much. In the show, all the characters are demonstrated with comparable competence, regardless of background. Two of the most brilliant characters are from the Undercity, and all the environmental pollution and probable fetal malnutrition doesn't seem to have significantly compromised V and Powder's physical prowess compared to their more privileged peers. They can be seen as exceptions, though, and this show is about extraordinary characters. Legends, if you will. But if you have to be extraordinary in order to get by, then your society is broken, or at the very least, in possession of significant opportunity for improvement. The larger point to all this is that the wealth gap manifests in many ugly ways across a spectrum of developmental areas, not only starting capital or educational opportunity, but even physical and psychological health, areas that are often attributed to be intrinsic or somehow outside the influence of the environment.
Who thinks it's all explained by nurture? Who think there's a magnificent, fascinating, nuanced interaction between nature and nurture?
When considering the problems severe wealth and freedom inequality bring about, it's tempting to either ignore the problem or look for an easy fix. The word solution comes to mind, but I don't like how complete that word sounds. Solution sounds like the whole of the problem has been fully understood and a perfect address is articulated. And in multifaceted problems like inequality, this simply isn't true. More importantly, falling into the trap of idealizing a simple idea like equality can lead to worse outcomes. As the conservative may say, the world sucks, but with your help, it can sure be worse.
We're not just close neighbors, we're one nation.
Nevertheless, I believe there are steps in the right direction. And in dealing with this massive systemic problem, Picketty provides more than a few digestible suggestions. The first step for me was to shift my idea of wealth a little. Wealth is often defined as money or income, but actually, it's a form of freedom. It's freedom to travel, the freedom to take risks, to study for a niche career without the loss of livelihood or future prospects. If you can't secure the job, it's the freedom to afford to pursue your passions. And more basically, it's the freedom from living on the street, from dying early of preventable shit, freedom to live. And some people need more than others. There is a balance that needs to be made between compromising the freedom of those at the very top and providing freedom from poverty experienced by those at the expanding bottom. A macro good is education access, basic and higher. Picketty asserts that over the past 2 centuries, education equality has played an important role in economic development. I think most people can understand that increasing the wider brain and talent pool is good, but educating people takes money, and the poorer individuals are as children or adults, the more slack the system has to provide to pull those people up. Narrowing or over-concentrating education resources to a small elite will favor and permeate that elite, eventually to the exclusion of others, because ultimately it's cheaper to build on privilege than compensate for it. Progressive taxation on income was an important step in transitioning ownership societies of the 18th and 19th centuries to the social democratic societies we enjoy today. And according to Picketty, the Americans led the way in this regard. In the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900 and beyond, as industrial and financial wealth accumulated, Americans worried that their country might one day become as inegalitarian as the societies of the Old World, which they viewed as oligarchic and therefore at odds with the democratic spirit of the United States. The Old World eventually followed suit. Between the mid-1910s and 1920s, Europe started progressively taxing wealth, and even more so following the Second World War. Picketty argues that the shocks of the two world wars, the tremendous destruction of wealth, including the loss of life, prompted Western Europe to follow suit. The United Kingdom also turned to progressive taxation, although it experienced much less destruction of wealth than either France or Germany between 1914 and 1945. It also worked to address the highly inegalitarian past by imposing steeply progressive taxes on income and estates. Tax revenues have risen and stabilized at different levels for different countries. 30% of national income in the United States, 40% in the UK, 45% in Germany, 50% in France and Sweden. No rich country has been able to develop on tax revenues limited to 10 to 20% of national income, as represented by early ownership societies of 18th and early 19th century Europe. This fiscal state, funded by taxes, has been central in modernization and developments we now consider essential. These include more egalitarian education systems, increasing healthcare access, setting aside funds for the elderly, or stabilizing the economy in times of recession or emergencies, such as unemployment nets, and sometimes bailing out large financial institutions that have fallen.
How about the fact that you sold hundreds of millions of that deal after your people knew it was a shitty deal? Does that bother you at all?
Also, there's defense, with the military historically commanding a large chunk of state spending. So, the fiscal state, the big government, or whatever one is inclined to call it, is important. But there is a conservative skepticism as to whether this bureaucracy should be allowed to grow, and I would argue that it should. In a modern, highly specialized service economy such as the US, education costs alone have grown massively, and spending has not kept pace. And failing to provide funds for mass higher education, i.e., shifting the costs of capital drain, debt, and risk of unemployment to the individual, is counterproductive. The current fiscal state in the US isn't spending enough on common good services, like education. And if the fiscal state needs more money, they need to use other methods besides just scraping the income class. This leads to Piketty's primary and most divisive call to action: a societal need to better catalog and tax wealth, i.e., capital-owned, stocks, bonds, art, physical assets, whatever property happens to be. Failure to do so will continue to compound inequality. Extracting wealth from income alone scrapes the curve into something ugly.
I sold some stock recently for $400,000, and my taxes on that have around $50,000. But that $50,000 is far less tax than anyone who has a job making $400,000 a year would pay.
And most of his wealth, well, isn't even taxable. People like Morris or Buffett are worth so much money because of the stock that they hold, but it's not tangible, spendable, taxable money. Some billionaires like Elon Musk are able to get loans against their stocks and live off of that. They don't even need to sell the stock to turn it into spendable money.
Much of the world's wealth isn't obtained by being paid to do a job. It's owned. If you own it, it was probably owned and grown before you were born, in various ways and packaged in various vehicles, usually to avoid losing it to the fiscal state, which tries to make up for the deficit by finding new ways to tax the larger base. Between 1990 and 2020, the average tax rate on the middle and working classes was equal or greater than the tax rate at the top. My general argument is that depriving the base to privilege the top is not a recipe for stability. Ultimately, these discussions of social welfare become discussions informed by culture. Economics and culture are tied in a way. Who we empathize in the story, the single person, character, or the group. Who do we primarily blame? An amorphous concept like peer pressure or the individual? Social collectivism, stereotyped historically around East Asia, or the fierce individualism stereotyped in American culture are examples of mindset in peoples. And they inform a lot, including how we engage with an issue like economic inequality. Since I'm biased from upbringing to look at the world individualistically, I'm first tempted to engage with inequality from the standpoint of a poor, hardworking person struggling to get by, or someone at the top trying to grow their empire and influence. I also tend to impart my own values into these hypothetical people I empathize with. As a result, my opinion on this issue or concept of wealth inequality is deeply informed by how I project it will affect me as a poor, hardworking male or a rich, hardworking male. Each projected person with their own goals. My poor hard worker self is striving for a better life for himself, family, and future, including children. My rich projection is striving for that and more resources, more grandiose goals. And while I think this way to picture the issue is adequate in getting me and others to appreciate the problem gross and uncorrected wealth inequality creates, it also blinds me to the more abstract nature of the problem. It does not come naturally for me to redirect my empathy from the individual and focus more on the system. So when I try, I tend to characterize the system, i.e. society, as an organism with its own wants and needs, like developing new technologies and infrastructure and the need to survive. But if I don't anchor these societal aspirations to the individual people that make up this massive organism, problems occur. If I empathize too much with the organism over the individuals who make up the organism, my empathy for the individuals evaporates. This makes me more prone to sacrificing the individual's needs and aspirations for whatever I view the greater good of society to be when it comes to considering all kinds of social issues. But maybe that's a problem with empathy. It leads us to care very much about a particular perspective over and often at the expense of others. And this is where the importance of choosing moral values comes in. Do I prioritize the individual freedom of an entrepreneur to look out for number one over the costs to others? Or do I prioritize everyone's right to an arbitrary level of service, be that health, education, and opportunity, over the costs of leaders and wealth to pursue their own purpose? In reality, these values aren't absolute. At least for me, values act more as benchmarks to help guide me where I'm willing to compromise. And they are hardly rational in the dispassionate sense of the word. They are very much driven from a strong emotional core. I think this is true for many people, even if they don't recognize it. The reason I've tried to articulate this whole mess is because determining that the inequality pictured in Arcane is bad, or how to fix it, isn't actually as simple as it might seem. You might see a proposed solution to progressively tax the top side and redistribute that wealth in the form of public services for everyone in Piltover to be a moral imperative, and demonize anyone who would stand against this. It doesn't matter if some people at the privileged top get robbed of their power and opportunity to pursue their own grand purpose. The needs of the masses outweigh any of that. But if you're like me, there is a limit to how far you're willing to carry that imperative. I believe humans have a great need beyond simply being able to eat and survive, and I don't know that I would want to live in a society that took any gains made by an individual and automatically redistribute them. I wouldn't want to live in a society that didn't allow people to pursue their own supremacy. I am opposed to the idea that one cannot be allowed to be greater than another, whatever one defines that to be. So, it's a balance, and my balance will be different from others. There are reasonable people whose balance will lean more towards social collectivism than mine, and vice versa. At the end of the day, we have our own emotionally driven moral principles, and there will be some variability between them, or, said in a more pro-individualistic way, everyone's unique, at least a little bit. I think it's important to recognize what these deeply emotional core principles are for each of us, in part because I believe we can make conscious decisions to change them when we become more informed about something, and the other reason is to avoid the traps of manipulations laid by other parties. It's okay, good even sometimes, to be angry. But it's really important to know why we're angry. Otherwise, we run the danger of becoming mindless pawns when we could at least be mindful ones. Coming back to Arcane, I'm impressed with the show's ability to develop characters organically. Characters in the background become important as the show decides, seemingly on a whim, to follow them closely so that they become protagonists. By the end, you have a very pulled back perspective. You have a better idea than any of the individual characters as to what is actually going on. And more importantly, you can empathize with each character's perspective. This often makes the conflicts emotionally resonant on both sides. This doesn't seem very significant, but when it comes to class conflicts in media, and for that matter, characterization in the real world, there is a strong tendency to vilify the other side. Take the popular Squid Game, touted as commentary on class inequality, and while it may have some prescient things to say about the dangers of servitude through private debt, which is a side effect of vast wealth inequality, the bad guys in this show are literally assholes. There isn't any reasonable point to be made from their side, because they are recognizably atrocious. PragerU and similar channels on YouTube are infamous for trying to inspire disgust for poor people. And these are efforts to code people negatively without even getting into race and ethnicity. These efforts to box people into envious and stupid are not new. They only serve to help divert attention from a more meaningful examination of the underlying problem. Arcane avoids this trap by rooting everyone's action to a purpose that most people can appreciate. Vander is reasonable in agreeing to maintain the status quo because he doesn't want everyone else to endure the cost of a war. I believe Silco is wrong in his efforts to free the Undercity because he is much less sensitive to the costs in lives than I am, and because I think he misunderstands the problem. Jace is reasonable for wanting to protect what he sees as the real Piltover. Like most people on the top side, he doesn't internalize the people in the Undercity as part of his own.
Why? There are people down there who seem hell-bent on destroying us. What were you doing?
I was consulting a friend about our quandary. I told you I knew someone.
Well, you didn't say they were from the Undercity.
What difference does that make?
They're dangerous.
I'm from the Undercity.
When Victor reminds him that they are all in this together, Jace is confronted with the reality that he does not have the tools to fix this problem. Like Vander, his primary tool is force, and also like Vander, he doesn't really want to use it. The show doesn't have an answer to the problem presented, the problem of societal inequality and large-scale disenfranchisement. These characters are not prepared with a proposal to index and tax wealth. In all their council meetings, there is a notable absence of representation from the Undercity, and there are no discussions about public education or any other social tools that might be developed to help empower individuals to pursue more pro-social occupations and pursuits. Capital in the 21st century was important to me not because it gave me an easy solution to rally behind, but because it got me to appreciate the larger problem in a very incomplete way. I appreciate Arcane because it presents this problem with a rare clarity in a cartoon epic about video game characters, no less. And it does so in an important way. It humanizes everyone involved. The prospect of a wider social fallout as a direct result of economic inequality is not something any one person in reality can fix, no matter how powerful we interpret them to be. It's just something we'll have to figure out together.